I will try to do. There we go. So thank you for your cooperation, and now I will try to share my screen. And start again with the slideshow. So there we go. And we are just volunteers, and we are basically not doing this as a day job. So when things go wrong, bear with us. We try to do as good a job as we can. So the opinions here, we always say that no matter if we or if not, the opinions expressed by contributors are not necessarily those of CUSJ. It might be, but not necessarily so. And it might be of some of us, and it might be of other people. So that's basically how the cookie crumbles. So welcome to the Let's Connect series of interactive meetings. We are having that every month, and except for in December, we are not having it. So this meeting, today's meeting, will feature Dying with Dignity Canada's Chris Jones, who's speaking to us. And our next CUSJ meeting will be on Saturday, November 25 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And Reverend Voltians Ndagijimana will speak about his experiences as Unitarian minister coming from Africa to Canada. He founded the Burundian Unitarian Universalist Church and was vice president of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, which unfortunately ceased to exist last year. Now, if you have any suggestion for a great subject or speaker, please let us know at cusjmedia@gmail.com. cusjmedia@gmail.com, or to president@cusj.org. So, and if you want to be part of our team of CUSJ board, we can use certainly some more people, and we have a great team, but we can always use some more people to help out. And the co-hosts of today are also members of our CUSJ board. The agenda right now is chalice lighting, Lent acknowledgement, and social justice issues across the country. How can we help you? Can you inspire us to do something similar in the different congregations? And then we come to the main event, and that is the presentation by Chris Jones. And after his presentation, which is about half an hour or whatever, we will have a question and answer.
Okay.
Okay, here we go with the chalice lighting, and I will stop the share for a minute.
Sorry I'm late, I got delayed. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody just come in?
Yeah, I just came in. I'm still a bit delayed at my congregation. I just have parental, so
Okay, Jim, welcome, and can you mute yourself from now on? We are starting, okay?
yeah, I'll join you in video shortly, okay?
Yes.
Lunch.
We're just doing the chalice lighting. Okay, here's a chalice that we use as a special container for our light that guides us in our actions, words, and deeds, and our ideas that we help to present. And today, because the topic is the state of dying with dignity in Canada, I have these words. Out of mystery, we are born, and mystery receives us when we die. I kindle this flame in this chalice to shed light on what is not a mystery while we live. The state of who and when in Canada one can legally choose assistance to take the journey home, back to the mystery. So let us hear all the news. I think I lost the light. I'll bring it back. Probably blew it out. And enjoy the new information to guide our way through the rest of our life. So may it be. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And you can see even when the light blows out, we can light it again.
Yes, I call this this smoke the spirit of life. That's what I call it.
Right. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I will share my screen again to keep the flow going. Here we go. Okay, so next slide here. So we have the land acknowledgement. We respectfully recognize and acknowledge the relationship that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Canada have with the land all Canadians live on and enjoy. This acknowledgement should only be a first step in eventually approaching restoring unceded land to the Indigenous nation or nations that previously had sovereignty over these lands. And if you want, you can put in the chat your own land acknowledgement. It's very welcome. And Chris will also share his land acknowledgement when he starts speaking. Please, now we have come to the current activities of your social justice committees. If there are any, I would like to hear about it. About 2 minutes per person to share if you have anything. And I will stop sharing right now so that we can see not all at the same time. Maybe nobody's terribly active, except for we are probably very much concerned about Gaza and things like that. Anything that you want to mention, Jake? You're muted.
Yes, well, there's nothing really to be said about what's happening there. Everyone knows. What is unconscionable is that most Western countries, including Canada, US, and so on, they're actually pushing for genocide. It is unbelievable.
Yes.
Saying one word about we have to solve the problem, we have to let the Palestinians have also their freedom and so on. Nothing. It's just Israel has the right to defend itself. Now go and kill as many as you want. And on this note, I would say, when the question is Israel has the right to itself, to self-defense, I would say categorically no. If they did what they did for 56 years to Gaza and the West Bank, and the last 17 years, total siege on Gaza and people dying and so on, what about the Palestinians? Don't they have a right to defend themselves? So before we talk about Israel having the right to defend itself, 100 times Gaza people and West Bank people have the right to defend themselves. Thank you.
Jake, what can we do to press? Should we write our MP, or what should we do?
Well, all the obvious things that we can do: demonstrate, write to MPs, write to MPPs, to anybody we know, just to basically educate the public. Because I know that still majority of the public in Canada and many other places really do not have a clue what's going on. They just got their knowledge from their media or from Trudeau, and they believe this 100%. Right. That more or less Gaza and Israel are equal in power, and Gaza is the aggressor all the time. So we have to educate the public wherever we can.
That's right. That's why we had our emergency meeting a week ago, or whatever, 2 weeks ago. Jim, you're having your hand up. Is it a reaction of what Jake said, or is it something you're doing for your own social action? Because we don't want a discussion right now, okay?
Just to react to what Jake said, best thing to do if you really want action on anything like that is you call Doug Ford, like his late brother Rob Ford. If you phone and leave a message with him, he'll call you back.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thank you, Jim. Any other actions, Kate? Do you have any action going on? And Joy, maybe, do you have any action going on in your congregation? No?
Not in my congregation, but yes, in our congregation, that is true. We have been rallying over the SOGI issue, the sexual orientation, gender identity. That's what SOGI stands for. That is a curriculum in the public schools in BC and throughout many provinces, and different districts or provinces are against it. Parents are against it, so we try to rally as best we can for it, because it's the students who need it the most. They need protection with this education, and it's a K-12 one. So we're quite active getting out there with our voices and our bodies to work for this program.
Great, thank you. And maybe we will have something on our Let's Connect meeting in January or so.
Yes, we're hoping to have a speaker or speakers on the subject matter in January for CUSJ's webinar.
Great, thank you. Margaret, anything going on in Toronto?
There's a faith and climate action group in Toronto of different denominations, headed by Michael Polani, who is a Unitarian, and planning an action for Saturday, November the 18th, against fossil fuel companies and the Canadian banks that support them and invest in them. So
Great.
that's in a few weeks.
Great.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, well, I think we sort of, unless somebody really has something more to say on social action right now, we would like to have this a little bit more active in future. And think about it next time you come. You don't have to be in the spotlight like we did now if you don't want to be, but it would be good to hear about things. Then I will share my screen again. Okay. So here we have Dying with Dignity and Chris Jones in the series Let's Connect UU Social Justice. Our speaker today is Chris Jones, and he is the Director of Government and Stakeholder Relations of Dying with Dignity of Canada. He will provide a detailed analysis of the major changes to the criminal code that Dying with Dignity Canada is seeking, and the broader political backdrop against which that is happening. And their website is dyingwithdignity.ca. It cannot be simpler. So there will be time for questions after the presentation. So I would say, take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Ellen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint here for you all, which may make things a little bit easier in terms of following what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So can you all see that?
Yeah,
okay.
I can see it, but you're still in edit mode or whatever. So
Oh, okay. Yeah,
slideshow.
just go to slideshow. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah. Anyways, so, well, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Ellen and Jim, for reaching out. I'd like to talk about a topic today that I know is somewhat controversial for some people, but I will try to present the issues as objectively and non-emotively as I can. So let me just begin perhaps with our own land acknowledgement. So just see if I can remove some of those. Okay, well, Dying with Dignity Canada, which off national office, which is based in Toronto, is on the traditional home of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Our presence on this land is not to be taken for granted. We are grateful for the opportunity to share, meet, collaborate, live, and work on this land. And additionally, we believe it's our responsibility as both an organization and as individuals to learn about the current and historical effects of settler colonialism in Canada. Oops. Page down here. I'm just having trouble advancing my screen here. Oh, there you go. I need to hit it. So, actually, I'd like to try and remove that. There we go. So I have an agenda for today's session. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own organization, then discuss an issue that's in the news, advance requests, talk also about MAID for mental disorders, and then an issue that we're encountering at the provincial level, which is institutional religious obstruction, or in its shorthand, sometimes known loosely as forced transfers. So about my own organization, it was founded in 1980 by a registered nurse named Marilyn Sagan. It's been around over 40 years now. It was incorporated as a registered Canadian charity in 1982. It has a staff of 15 based in Toronto, although I am in Ottawa. I'm one of the currently 2 employees based up here because my work mostly involves dealing with the federal government, who oversees the criminal code. So we do a lot of government affairs and advocacy work here in Ottawa, although we do work as well in the provincial capitals. It's overseen by a board of 13 people. We have 2 advisory councils made up of physicians or clinicians, the Clinicians Advisory Council and the MAID for Mental Disorders Advisory Council. And we are funded exclusively by private donations from individual supporters, donations, bequests, and contributions in kind. We have no government funding, and we receive no corporate funding either. So our mission is, as you can see, to ensure access to quality end-of-life choice and care through 3 things: advocacy, which I do, education, and support. And I would argue that our latter vocation of support is probably the most important one. We have a team of 3 individuals who provide advice to folks and family members seeking MAID from every aspect of it, to the initial application process, to witnessing, to various other psychosocial kind of needs. We don't provide explicit counseling, and we don't certainly do assessments. That's reserved exclusively for clinicians, but we kind of provide some general background support. So I thought I'd run through a little bit the brief kind of potted history of the jurisprudence and the legislation. Just a couple of slides, excuse the density of them. So as a quick reminder, in 1993, the Supreme Court dismissed the appeal by Sue Rodriguez, who had been challenging the prohibition on assisted suicide. That was a close run thing. I think it was like a 5-4 vote. In 2012, the BC Supreme Court rules that the right to die with dignity is protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that is also appealed by the feds. In 2015, we have the beginnings of the ultimate ruling that brought us Maid, and that was Gloria Taylor and Kay Carter arguing that their Section 7 rights to liberty and security of the person were being infringed. The Supreme Court agreed and declared that Section 241 of the Criminal Code was henceforth invalid. That's the one that criminalizes the taking of life by a physician. In 2016, the government responds with its first piece of legislation, C-14. It receives royal assent, and it allows MAID, medical assistance in dying, with strict eligibility criteria, safeguards, and a 10-day waiting period. A little later on in 2019, we have, and by the way, in that first instance of C-14, death had to be reasonably foreseeable. In this case, in 2019, two individuals in Quebec, Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladue, challenged the argument, the insistence on a reasonably foreseeable death requirement in C-14, arguing that they were suffering grievously nonetheless. And the Quebec Superior Court agrees with them in finding that the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement violates their charter rights. So the government, of course, responds because it has to at that point. It doesn't, incidentally, refer the matter to the Supreme Court. It takes it as read that it would lose any such reference and legislates C-7 in 2021, which removes the requirement for a reasonably foreseeable death and also introduces the waiver of final consent, sometimes known as Audrey's Amendment. So it makes those changes to the criminal code, and henceforth RFND is now also possible, non-RFND, to be honest. Then the next kind of significant piece of legislation, I would say, would be this year, C-39. The original bill, C-7, had included a sunset clause which temporarily suspended the coming into force of MAID for a mental disorder. And so that was about to expire in March of 2023. There was a lot of controversy about that. The government quickly adopted some legislation. It passed at breakneck speed, and it delayed the exclusion of MDS-UMC. That stands for, by the way, mental disorder as a sole underlying medical condition, until March of 2024. So that received royal assent, and hence we are now 6 months away from having MDS-UMC in the spring. But I want to turn so that's kind of a brief history. I want to turn my attention now to three substantive issues. The first is an advance request, which some of you may have heard about. And I've got a definition here from the Canadian Bar Association. So it is effectively a request made by a capable person, namely the applicant, who has been diagnosed with a grievous and irremediable medical condition, where the request is triggered in the event of the applicant's subsequent incapacity and on the occurrence of specified future circumstances detailed in a written document. These are known as triggering conditions. So that is effectively what that is. So here's a little slide which kind of shows the difference between an advance request and something that was brought in a couple of years ago, the waiver of final consent. The waiver of final consent is where you have been assessed for MAID, you've been approved, a date has been set, and everything is about to happen. And then, and your death has to be, in that case, reasonably foreseeable. It's not yet for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. And the disease prognosis would indicate a likely loss of competence in the interim. So in that event, the patient and the clinician may sign a waiver of final consent to allow MAID to proceed on or slightly before that specified date as a function of your clinical state at the time. Clearly, you're going to be irreversible. There's no chance of a recovery, and you've already indicated a clear desire for MAID. And I just want to specify, of course, that you would all know that MAID is a completely voluntary activity. It must be, there must be no evidence of coercion of any kind. The individual must freely consent to it from the beginning to the end, and normally with repeated instances of such request over a period of time. So now an advance request, by contrast, is something slightly different. It's when you, as I indicated, when you would specify upon a diagnosis of a qualifying condition that you anticipate, given the likely trajectory of that illness, that once there's a set of triggering conditions that exist, and these are quite often with neurocognitive disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on, various other dementias, that when those conditions are met, that you would like that clinician to honor your wishes and administer MAID. Now, that can be made several years in advance, and without, at this point, unlike a waiver of final request, without a date given, but you would still have to meet the objective criteria for MAID. Eventually, you would be assessed. But if you lose consciousness, cannot give what's called contemporaneous consent, which is normally what's required, you would then, in theory, upon a somebody you've designated as a sort of kind of supplementary decision maker, or somebody who's going to alert the clinician that you've reached a stage where those conditions you specified have obtained and you are suffering grievously, they will alert the clinician, who will then have an onus or an obligation to verify that that is indeed true. Then at that time, it's possible that MAID would be administered at your request. Now, we'll get into some of the technicalities of that, but that's the gist of it. Oops, having trouble moving forward here. Let's see if that page down. Oh, okay. There we go. Again, in summary, an advance request is a written declaration that may be administered if the individual has lost capacity to consent, if there are enduring conditions. Loss of autonomy is a typical one that many people cite, that they believe is too much for them to bear. Intolerable suffering related to their serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. And they are clearly identified in the declaration. They would have been ascertained by a MAID agent, that was the term I was looking for, and can be observed by the physician or nurse practitioner. So we are talking here about a situation in which you have a diagnosis. In other words, post-diagnosis. You've got a condition, clinical condition, it's well known, it will likely have certain outcomes over time. And so that is kind of the ideal starting point for an advance request. Now, there is another argument that some would make, that you shouldn't necessarily need to have a diagnosis. That, let's say you've got a family history of high blood pressure and strokes, and that you yourself suffer from that, and that there's maybe some of your family have sustained strokes and suffered grievously. You may be concerned that fate may befall you, and therefore you would want to be able to specify, in the event that happens to me, even though I presently don't have a stroke, that you would honor that situation should it occur. And for somebody who's got that kind of a family history, that may be a compelling argument. However, we're more convinced that in the short term, the legislators are only likely to allow advance requests with a diagnosis for the moment. Although we hope that if it goes through eventually, to be able to change that view and expand the definition. But basically, it does require consent be obtained. Draft triggering conditions would be easier to be outlined and specified and detailed, given that you would know your prognosis. And it's also consistent with couple of things. Quebec's recent Bill 11, which makes provision for advanced requests. And it says in the case of a diagnosis that is known. The Senate Public Bill S248, which is not yet public, which is not yet law, also calls for advanced requests with a diagnosis. And then finally, the recent report of the Joint House-Senate Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying also called for with a diagnosis. So our view on advanced requests is that they respect the fundamental charter principle of security of the person and the sanctity of personal autonomy. And this is what the Canadian Bar Association also believes. So the challenge in not having an advanced request regime in this country, which we presently don't, is that individuals with capacity impairing conditions effectively are forced into two situations. For the first one is that it's loosely known as missing the window. It's basically fear of losing capacity. In other words, that ability to give contemporaneous consent leads them to want to take MAID earlier. So they end up opting for it earlier than they would because they want to be secure in the knowledge that they can give consent to the clinician. The other is that if you miss the window, as many people do because they don't know about it, maybe their doctor doesn't tell them, then they slip into a state where they can't give consent and cognition is no longer there, and they end up suffering in a very detrimental way for, in some cases, a long period of time. And many of us know individuals in my own family. I had an uncle who went through this, and it's a slow, very slow degenerative process. So the result of not having this legal provision is anxiety, stress, and fear of missing the window. The other thing that people do sometimes to ensure that they can give consent is they forego pain management. Because if you are heavily sedated, you quite often your thinking is not clear, you can't give consent. So this forces people who want to retain that clearness of mind to forego pain management. Well, that is equated to suffering, right? And then also it clearly results in premature requests for MAID. So our belief is that allowing a wider patient population to access MAID would thereby avoid the hastening of a MAID provision and, on the other side, long-term or intense suffering. So our view is that in a philosophical sense, an advanced request for MAID maximizes autonomy and self-determination by enabling individuals to affect decisions about their end-of-life plans in the event of a capacity loss. And so this particular view is endorsed by the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. They do support the right of folks living with dementia to have autonomy over decisions affecting their health. And that includes an advanced request. They think it is necessary. And a number of the folks who testified over the last year at the AMAD committee in Ottawa were individuals diagnosed with these conditions or had seen a loved one recently deteriorate. And they also made the case that they feel that this ability to make an informed decision and to retain autonomy is critical to them. And they believe it's something that a compassionate and humane society would want to have. Now, at the moment, with one exception, Quebec, there's no jurisdiction in the country or federally that allows them. But Quebec has broken the pattern, and as of June of this year, it has amended its own End-of-Life Care Act to allow specifically for advanced requests. So that was voted on. 103 members of the Assembly in Quebec out of 125 voted for it. So there is a substantial consensus in Quebec about the desirability of that. So the Bill 11, as it was known, has a number of what we believe are safety features that are worth replicating nationwide. So the patient, assisted by a physician or a specialized nurse practitioner, would detail what physical or psychological conditions constitute intolerable suffering. It also includes additional safeguards. It must be medically recognized as a result of the patient's particular illness, and it also must be objectively observable. There is an oversight body, the Commission on End-of-Life Care, and it ensures that the providers will comply with the provisions of the bill, and it's composed of 11 health and social service professionals, including doctors, nurses, pharmacists, social workers, legal experts, lawyers, and notaries, users of institutions, folks involved in ethics, bioethics, and the institutions themselves. And then finally, the important thing to remember is that there would always be a strong commitment to honoring the demonstration of refusal, so that if the patient voluntarily demonstrates through words, sounds, or gestures at the time of MAID provision that he or she doesn't want this procedure, then the MAID becomes invalid. Now, there is something known as involuntary demonstration, which the law already accounts for, and that does not invalidate AR. Now, that's a very clinical matter, and I wouldn't be able to comment on it, but it's understood to be situations where they're kind of reflexive movements that could be construed as a refusal, but are actually not. And that is in accordance with current federal laws. Okay, so here are the other safety features that we think that the federal government contemplating this initiative should keep in mind. The information should be provided to the patient in a clear and accessible manner. When drafting the advanced request, the patient is to be assisted by a competent professional. That might be a notary or a lawyer. The professional obligation to inform a patient about withdrawal, modification processes, triggering conditions, results in a MAID assessment by 2 competent professionals. So it's not just one doctor, it has to be 2. A trusted third person may be designated as well as alternates, and that person would look after the well-being and welfare of the individual, the applicant, and they would be legally kind of seen as such within the system of decision-making once the patient loses capacity. And they're the ones responsible for notifying the care team that the triggering conditions appear to have been met. And Quebec also keeps a provincial directory of all advanced directives, which now includes advanced requests for MAID. So for an AR to be valid, it must be registered in the provincial directory. So we wouldn't be alone in pursuing this if we did it. It does exist in other countries. It's strictly monitored and controlled. The Netherlands has one called an Advanced Euthanasia Directive, minimum age 16, a standard form with a personal statement, and the doctor and the patient have to reach the conclusion that the patient's suffering is hopeless and unbearable, and it's overseen by regional committees. Belgium has a similar provision. It must be drafted or affirmed within 5 years for it to be valid. There's no minimum age. Any legally competent person or emancipated minor, which we have not got to here, and so we needn't worry about that here. And there is some oversight done by federal control and evaluation. Likewise, in Luxembourg, there is a similar system, minimum age of 18, and they seek a renewal and confirmation of those requests every 5 years. And finally, in Spain, it's the exception to the normal contemporaneous consent requirement, but it's for people who lack capacity, suffer a serious and incurable illness or chronic and impossible condition. They have a legal directive signed previously prior to their capacity loss, and it applies to folks who are 16 at minimum. So in terms of additional safeguards, we believe that there should be an individual's preference has to remain stable over time. This can't be a very recent thing. It has to have been expressed repeatedly, consistently, that will help somebody to feel if the 5-year renewal is the maximum period, then the provider will feel a little more confident carrying out an advance request. It will change things a bit because the provincial laws, if it's one thing for the feds to decriminalize it, there would have to be some corresponding changes in provincial rules around consent, which govern what clinicians can do in certain situations. So it's not just a matter of the feds changing the law. There would have to be some corresponding changes provincially. It's currently a provision in the Senate bill I mentioned earlier, Bill S-248, and the requirement for a 5-year validity period is in existence in Belgium and Luxembourg. Some people would argue that you don't need a validity limit because partially the cost, you have to keep renewing it. There is a risk that somebody would lapse. It would lapse due to patients' forgetfulness or lack of access to resources, so they might not update it, but they might still want an AR. So there may be some issues there, unintended barriers to access. But in the end, we kind of believe that a 5-year validity limit should be implemented if the government or some designated government agency takes on the responsibility of reaching out and ensuring that those requests have been affirmed or updated. So in terms of, we'd also be looking for interprovincial compatibility. So if this were to happen, let's say I make one in Saskatchewan, but I move to Nova Scotia, I would want the one I made in Saskatchewan to be eligible and recognized in Nova Scotia. So we need to have some kind of a set of minimum acceptability standards. Having that kind of interprovincial recognition or some federal oversight would allow us to keep track of trends and data and so on, and I think that's important. Quebec, as we mentioned, does have a provincial level registry that will include advance requests. It currently includes DNR orders for surgeries and so on. And in the Netherlands, they have a database hosted by the Ministry of Health that publishes an annual report. So these are some of the kinds of safeguards that we think would have to be built in. In terms of polling, and I haven't leaned on that too much in this presentation, but we survey regularly with Ipsos, our partner, in fairly thorough ways. It's a large sample with a lot of data. I'm not suggesting that other polling instruments that you may have seen of late aren't equally rigorous and valid, but we ask the same questions repeatedly and we couch it in fairly clear, specific language. And what it shows is universally a very high level of popularity across Canada, across regions, across age groups and income categories, across religious affiliation. There's just an understanding that there's a lot of needless suffering, and a lot of people feel that this is a sensible precaution to take or a measure to take, providing safeguards and precautions are in place. So that's kind of, we believe they're an autonomy bolstering tool that can enhance one's life in terms of the end of one's life with dignity. Now, I want to move on to the second topic, and then we can come back to questions. And this is a little bit more of a contentious one. It's been in the news a lot of late. And this is made for mental disorders as the sole underlying medical condition, SUMC. It's a track 2 condition, which means that death is not reasonably foreseeable. So in track 1 is when death is foreseeable. You've got metastatic cancer, for instance. But in this case, your death is not imminent, but you are suffering nonetheless. And so what happened with this was in the C7 bill, which came into force in 2021, the government introduced a sunset clause for 2 years, postponing its coming into force until March of 23. Again, there was a controversy, and that was postponed a further year until March of 2024. Now, we believe that it affirms the charter rights of Canadians. It is aimed at avoiding the stigma and differential treatment of individuals based on their illness type. At the moment, it's a little bit like we're saying physical illnesses are worthy and merit this kind of relief from suffering, but a lifelong struggle with a serious mental disorder doesn't. And the suffering, we believe, is no different in many respects. So that's one of the arguments. But I think what we see really is the safeguards that are built in here. So the anticipated profile is someone who has a long-standing mental disorder, who's received a substantial amount of therapeutic interventions for a prolonged period of time, but still continues to suffer intolerably and unremittingly. So it's a fairly unique case. It's not the garden variety of depression and anxiety that somebody might present with earlier in their life. This is these are often chronic conditions. We haven't had any, of course, yet, but they would be very different from some of what has been bandied about in the news. An applicant must make a voluntary request to a physician or nurse practitioner asking to be assessed. So once again, completely voluntary for just to be assessed. So this language that's been used in a number of polls recently, that individuals are being offered MAID, is such a travesty. Nobody is offered MAID. You have to request it, and then you have to be assessed. And it has to be a voluntary request. So you don't walk into a hospital and be told, would you like to have MAID today? That's not how it works. 2 physicians or nurse practitioners must independently assess you. They must be trained in MAID assessment, and they must perform due diligence on a case-by-case basis. So it's a very thorough process. It would typically require, it doesn't mandate right away, but usually the first doctor or clinician would likely be the patient's own family physician. But it would, if you're presenting for a mental disorder, it's very likely that the second independent physician would be a psychiatrist or somebody who is an expert in your condition. And the other safeguard is that 90 days must pass between the assessment and the provision. And during that time, the patient must be informed of alternative treatments and offered consultations with relevant professionals. And quite often 90 days would be the minimum. And in fact, some of our folks who are clinicians who are involved in this work in terms of getting ready for it say that in practice, it would typically be 6 months to a year just in practice because of the need to verify things. Nothing like this is undertaken because it's so final, would be undertaken in a kind of trivial manner. Another important safeguard is if you come in with suicidal ideation or you are presently in an acute crisis, no provision of MAID occurs. So this has to be a deliberate, repeated, constant request made over a lengthy period of time for someone who has a long-standing mental disorder that has caused that person immense suffering over many decades. So if you come in, as again, some media have misleadingly alleged, because you're feeling down and you're 25 and things aren't going well, you've maybe had a broken relationship, you are not going to be getting MAID in the hospital that day. That is not a possibility. So that there needs to be a little bit, I'm sorry if I sound a little bit outspoken about that, but there's been a lot of myths that have been, and misinformation that have been put out there in the last 6 months about this. And we do need to debunk some of it. So what else was done by way of safeguards? There was an expert panel on MAID and mental illness that reported in 2022. It made 19 recommendations regarding requests for medical assistance dying for somebody who has a mental illness. The federal government and the provinces have recently put together, Health Canada, a model practice standard and an accompanying document known as Advice to the Profession. It was published in March of this year. It's the first time in our history that the federal government has led a collaborative and comprehensive approach to clinical standard setting in this country. So because they're aware of how controversial it was, they convened a committee, they got experts together, they said, how would you approach irremediability? How would you approach diagnosis? And then they put together something which they then shared with the provinces. Normally the provinces devise this advice to their own clinicians by themselves. The feds have done that. So, and then on top of that, we have an organization called the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, CAMAP, and it's also just completed a MAID curriculum, which includes a module specific to MAID for mental disorders. So all of that to say that we anticipate a very small number of individuals would be eligible under this criterion. It's not, this is what our clinicians are saying. They're people who have just suffered for a lifetime or a lengthy period of time, and that is the target group, if you like, or the group that would be eligible. There's no target group. The group that would be coming forth with a request, and these other notions that MAID is somehow seen to be an economy measure or a budget saving measure are just they should hardly be dignified with a response. They're so outrageous, some of the things that are being said in the media at the moment. I wanted to move now to the last topic and then take your questions. And this is an issue that we're encountering at the provincial level. And that's the issue of institutional religious obstruction, or what we loosely call forced transfers. And this is where people's lawful access to MAID is being impeded or obstructed by faith-based institutions, hospitals, hospices, long-term care facilities, who object to MAID. It's also, to a lesser extent, also encountered in certain secular facilities based on particular palliative care philosophies. Not by no means everyone, but just in some, where some people view palliative care and MAID as completely opposite ends of the spectrum, and that you cannot have MAID in that setting. There are some doctors that have that view. So it's not restricted just to religious denominational institutions. It has taken place in some secular ones. These are often top-down decisions. They're not universally shared by all the staff. And the restrictions consist of refusing to allow the staff or outside health professionals to give information, assess eligibility, or provide MAID. And this results in what's known as a forced transfer, where if the person follows through on their desire to have MAID, they insist on it, then the hospital or hospice will transfer you to another institution, a non-objecting institution. But that often happens at the 11th hour, and it's not a very pleasant experience. Now, there's been some research about this by Canadians, but funded by an Australian grant. The Australian Centre for Health Law Research funded an extensive amount of research in the last year. And what it found was that this policy of religious objection or obstruction, it harms patients and families through stigmatization, less choice about where to die, additional advocacy, paperwork, and logistics that the family or the applicant then has to engage in, disrupted therapeutic relationships, because when a patient indicates a desire for MAID, if the doctor or the folks on the ward or the management of the hospital disagree, then that previous patient relationship, which may have resulted in a very good level of care, is disrupted. And then there is the suffering brought on by forced transfers themselves, which often occur under heavy sedation. And there can be problems with that if somebody is in the final stages of cancer, and maybe any kind of movement is also incredibly painful. And also it kind of disrupts the notion that if you're in a long-term care home or maybe even a hospice where you've been for a while, you've come to regard that as your home. And suddenly you're being told that your home isn't your home. And because you're requesting what is a lawful procedure and recognized as such, you must nonetheless leave this place and go to another place. The research also shows that it harms health professionals. So the first is those who might not agree with their institution's policy have a sense of failing the patient. They have some distress from witnessing the forced transfer against conscience because they feel it goes against their own conscience. It may create tensions with other healthcare professionals. And finally, it can cause conflict between that healthcare worker and the institutional position, you know, the hospital's views. Finally, it also may add workload pressures because individuals are forced to find alternative locations that would accept the patient who is seeking MAID. Quite often, this is done right at the very end. Death is imminent. There's significant pain at that point, and the person just wants relief. Instead, some folks are tasked with finding another location, and that adds stress to everybody's life. So what do we think needs to happen? We think that we need to start putting patients first. Institutions should educate themselves on the harms to patients and adopt a patient-centered approach to avoid them. We also believe there needs to be support to certain health professionals within objecting institutions. Those who do not support the official policy, they go through a great deal of stress. They are forced to suppress their views, and that may aggravate their conscience, give them a sense of guilt. So some kind of help there. We think there should be stronger regulation. Patients may have limited geographical treatment options. So in some places, a denominational hospital that bans MAID may be the only option for that patient. And so if right away that's not going to be possible in that place, then that is really constraining the rights of a Canadian to kind of pursue the medical treatment they wish. And I think when we get down to it, there is a clash between an institution's desire or wish not to provide these services with the existential suffering that somebody is enduring at the end of their life. And to decide in the favor of the former rather than the latter seems not right to many of us. And finally, we believe another argument is simply that the Canada Health Act had 5 principles. It ensures, portability, comprehensiveness of services, and public dollars go into those institutions. And if you are selectively deciding that you will only implement the ones you approve of, and that could also include abortion, women's reproductive rights, various other procedures, then that's kind of an a la carte approach to the Health Act. And we don't think in the 21st century that's the way things should go. If a hospital entirely in its own resources, or a hospice or a care home that isn't accepting any public funding wants to go that route, that's their prerogative. But we think that where the public dollars are in place, that individuals should have access to their services. So I'm sorry I spoke for a bit of time there, but I hope that gave you some sense of what some of the issues are and what we're dealing with. And I haven't even talked about the situation in Parliament at the moment. Maybe we can get into that. It's a very fraught environment right now. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. And let's see, can you stop your screen? Yeah, there you go. I will remove the spotlight right now. So we've come to the question and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand. You will be first in line. I see Janet has her thumbs up. And Joy will be the one who keeps track of how many seconds you have left. I'm not going to spotlight the questioner, but I might spotlight Chris. I'll see. Anyway, so keep it about 2 minutes long, not longer. Joy will cut you off, and we might even mute you, but I've never done that before, so I'm not that mean. And well, I would keep it respectful and meaningful and constructive, please. And there we go. So Janet.
Thank you. About the 5-year period, I'm concerned that, for example, I know somebody who developed Parkinson's at a very young age, and it progressed extremely rapidly. And so that person would not be eligible. So I want to know what you thought about that sort of situation.
Well, first of all, you would need to be 18 years of age. You would need to have a health card in a particular province. So you need to be eligible for healthcare in that province. But then aside from that, as long as you could competently make a request for an advance request in writing with the aid of maybe a notary or a lawyer, then, as long as you are competent at the time you make it, that would be the only challenge. So if you're saying that person was no longer competent, then they must be able to request this voluntarily with full cognizance of what it entails. Sorry, you're muted.
You're muted, Janet. Janet, you're muted. We couldn't hear what you were saying, Janet.
Okay.
Yeah,
it sounds like there would be an exception in that case. She wasn't close to 18, but she was probably 40, and that's unusual to be requiring nursing home, say at 42, a very rapid development. And so as long as exceptions would be made in that sort of case,
this is all theoretical at this point in time because we don't have an advanced request regime. And of course, nobody can judge these matters aside. The only person eligible to talk about this would be that individual's clinician or nurse practitioner.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up. Does anyone still have a question? I cannot imagine you wouldn't. Or it's been, Chris, you've been so clear and transparent that so Janet, you have another question. Is that true? Or you're still muted?
I've finally unmuted myself. Yes, a while ago, I'm in a writing group and
you're muted again. You're muted again. There we go.
So I wrote a short story about 3 siblings coming to terms with their father's requests for made. And I was a little leery. It was published in an anthology by a writing group last fall. And I was just a little leery about somebody suing me. I'd love to send it to you, Chris, and see what you think. Hopefully nobody would be up in arms by the story. I thought it could be very helpful to families that are dealing with it. But I'd love to be assured that I haven't written anything that's going to cause people to be lined up outside my house.
Is it fictional?
Yes.
Oh, then you're okay.
I did mention, I did mention something that was said appeared in the Ottawa Citizen, where they had written about how certain hospitals were talking to patients, suggesting, have you considered MAID? And, obviously it was changed. Anyway.
Can I just on that point, just jump in because that has come up recently. And I want to just try to provide a little bit of background on that. So if a patient meets the clinical profile, in other words, these are just some of them, they may be advanced in age, they may have a terminal illness that is in its irreversible stage, they may be suffering intolerably. The doctor in Canada has an obligation to make them aware of all of their medical options. So that is just a standard obligation that a doctor has. Only you wouldn't make that recommendation to a 25-year-old who's perfectly, reasonably healthy, but has maybe one chronic. It has to be a multiplicity of conditions that would lead the clinician to say, I am duty bound to let you know that in addition to palliative care, in addition to pain relief, in addition to some therapies you may wish to try, MAID is also an option, but it is only brought up in that particular context. It's not brought up whimsically. And I think that we've seen a lot of what I think we found very frustrating, and I hear this from the clinicians, because of patient confidentiality and the strict requirement not to comment on the case of an individual, where maybe a relative or some neighbor has made some comment to the media about how the MAID provision went down, there is no way for the physician to comment or rebut or say anything about that particular case. Confidentiality and privacy require that nothing be said. So there's been just so you guys are all aware, there's a whole lot of stuff that's been put out there in the last year that we know from our clinicians, not that they comment on individual cases to us, but they will say something like, the circumstances of that were far more complex than is being allowed in the media. And that's the problem, is that only one side of these stories is getting out there.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. I see there is another question. I hope, Janet, you're informed a bit better now. Yeah. Okay, so Janine, you're the next.
Hi there. I've got two questions. The first is, I've heard that St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, which is a Catholic hospital, but I think is publicly funded, possibly may not allow MAID. And the other question is, if someone has a properly documented MAID request, they've gone through everything, can a relative interfere with MAID taking place?
So on the first one, what we have in some hospitals, it's a concession that was made in recent years, was that what they are allowing, some of those denominational hospitals, and I think St. Paul's is one of them, or St. Michael's is one of them, is they allow an outsider to come in and do an assessment. So they won't allow the provision, but they will occasionally allow the assessment. So that's at least a step forward. But they certainly, very few of them would allow a provision under any circumstances. There's a technical way some may be tempted to get around it because they're coming under increasing pressure, particularly in BC, where St. Paul's has been in some hot water over this, is they're thinking of designating a room or a ward or some facility attached to the hospital as not part of the hospital in kind of legal terms, even if it's physically joined up, and saying MAID could happen there. But generally, you're right. Many of these places at most will do an assessment, but some won't even do an assessment. So that's that. Sorry, what was your second question again?
The second question was, if you have a properly done MAID assessment, you're ready to go, whatever, can a family member who, say for religious reasons, doesn't believe in it, can they interfere with that happening?
So the answer to that is no. The request, when it's coming from a competent individual, is solely a matter between that person and his or her clinician. And that's what's caused, you've seen some of these stories in the Fifth Estate and some of these other investigative shows where say children or relatives complain about how the fact that their doctor didn't alert them to the fact that their loved one was about to pursue MAID. And the reason for that is that there are many cases in Canada and around the world where people have abusive relationships or there have been problems in their earlier life, and they would be fearful that somebody else would countermand or negate that particular request. So the healthcare system is designed to ensure that it's only the patient and his or her physician, and that as providing the person's over 18, no other family members are allowed to veto or pass judgment on them.
Well, thank you, Chris. I have a question.
Sure.
Didn't put my hands on, but nobody else is putting their hands on. before it was all legislation, I know that there was another way of doing it, and that was stopping eating and drinking. And then in 8 days, you were basically gone. And according to nurses and doctors, it was an 8 on the scale of from 1 to 10 of a good death, if you can say that. Is that still done, or do you know, or is it an individual thing that people just quietly do? Because
Yes.
yeah.
So you raised a fascinating topic, which is now the subject of some debate and discussion, which is, for the longest time prior to MAID, palliative care physicians made judgments, often in conjunction with relatives of sick individuals, about what should be the course of action. And quite often that consisted of overprescribing morphine, or, as you say, pulling away food and water, not hooking people up to different machines that might prolong life. And the MAID doctors, the clinicians who agree to provide MAID, are often put on the hot seat for this decision that some others view as unsavory and unpalatable. But the rejoinder would simply be that for many years, palliative care physicians have often made those very same decisions and choices in conjunction with a family member about what would happen. And that was always accepted and tacitly understood as an acceptable practice. It was just never mentioned. And I think what we're trying to say, I think what some of these clinicians are now saying is, look, every single MAID provision that happens in Ontario is referred to the coroner's office. So they are all reviewed, right? Unless, and others on a selective basis in other provinces are. So there's a certain level of scrutiny that adheres to every MAID provision in most cases. That wasn't always the case in palliative care. Now, we think palliative care physicians do a wonderful job. They're providing really important life-affirming care and relief for people. So there's absolutely no criticism of it. But we just don't believe that just because somebody is bringing, at that very end, when somebody has changed their mind and now wants relief and a dignified end, that somehow those physicians are doing something that is just, it's not compatible with traditional medicine. And I think a lot of people feel strongly that that's not the case. So.
Okay, any other questions? So thank you very much, Chris. If there are none, I still have another one.
Sure.
Oh, okay, Margaret. Margaret first. I will be on cell. Okay, first, Margaret.
Question: if a doctor on principle disagrees with MAID, is that doctor obligated to refer to another clinician who would go ahead with the procedure?
Yes, you're quite correct, Margaret. So it's known as the effective referral obligation. So any clinician, it's provided for in the criminal code amendments. No clinician is obliged to perform MAID. And if they choose not to, they only have one obligation, and that is to provide an effective referral to another physician who doesn't object. That's not to say that other physician will green light or rubber stamp the request for MAID, but at least they will engage in the assessment of that individual. So that is an obligation under our healthcare system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sal, I saw you had your hand up, but maybe you had the same kind of question. Okay, there we are. You're muted.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Yes, I had written it in the chat, but
oh, I missed
I'll just read it out. To Chris, you mentioned disinformation in the media, especially within the last year. Yep. Hoping that you mean social media threads and not our professional Canadian news media. Could you clarify on that, please?
Well, we would have seen distortions, misinformation, and embellishments in both sorts of media. So clearly, in the Toronto Sun, for instance, we've seen some stuff that is demonstrably problematic. but clearly there's even far more of that on social media threads where anything goes effectively. By the way, my comments, I hope and trust I'm making them candidly and in the knowledge that we're a group here, and that I should have said this at the outset. I assume that anything I say stays within this group. These are, I mean, I'm espousing the views of our organization, and I think they're transparent and clear. But I should, I just wouldn't want anything I've said now to be.
We are planning to put it on YouTube, but the view is basically only our people of the CUSJ.
Yes, that's fine. That's okay. Yeah. That's okay. I just want to make sure that this was kind of a session amongst your members and not for other people. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. I have one other question, and that is, in the Netherlands, the legislation was quite years and years ago that euthanasia was allowed in the law. What happened, unfortunately, and I don't know if that is happening here too or not, before doctors would make a little nudge of decision in according to living wills and all that kind of precautions, that they would give a little bit more morphine or something like that, and the person would gently go over the rainbow, as it were. But then the legislation came through, and suddenly, because of all the restrictions, people were dying before it was approved that they would go through this procedure. And that is all my question I have, John.
Sure. So that's a really valid point, and it's a kind of paradoxical point. We saw the other day when Health Canada released its 2022 annual report on the state of MAID in Canada, that 2,900 people, I believe is the figure, died while waiting for MAID. So there are a large number of folks who, for various reasons to do with, first of all, their geographic location, or if they are track 2, in other words, death is not reasonably foreseeable. So, those ones our clinicians spend a great deal more time examining, assessing the basis for it, determining whether it's legitimate or not. Those ones take longer, hence, and that's the way it should be. It's due diligence being done. But the point is that exactly on your point, Ellen, that these hurdles that one must jump through are fairly rigorous, and they will slow the process down. I think in one point, I did want to bring up something that's related to that I think is really powerful. One of the assertions of folks who believe that the mental disorders piece is completely inappropriate and no civilized society should be allowing folks with mental illnesses to have access to MAID. The irony is that many people who are despairing for lack of either treatment and counseling are often driven to other actions, namely suicide, which is tragic and which we would always want to avoid. And we fully support anti-suicide measures. The paradox is that I believe that if somebody then comes to the hospital because they now know that MAID for a mental disorder is a lawful activity, they will then be forced to undergo an assessment. And what I actually believe, and I think some of our clinicians are making this point, it's not out there in the media yet, is that very act of assessment may result in treatment, prescription of new medications, new therapies, new ways of attempting to handle the underlying trauma and angst that person is dealing with, which might actually, in the long run, reduce the incidence of suicide. So it's the fact that people will now be getting, if they want this, they're going to have an assessment. At the moment, because it's illegal, they regrettably take matters into their own hands, or if they're rich enough, they go to Switzerland where they can have a procedure done there. So I think that in some paradoxical ways, this might actually improve that situation.
Oh, very interesting. Well, I think we have exhausted our Q&A session. And Chris, thank you so much for giving us all this information. I think we come more enriched away from this. And thank everybody for coming. We will now do the extinguish the chalice, Joy. You're muted.
Just need a moment. And we have our chalice has been lit throughout. And as I extinguish this light, may the warm sharing remain kindled in our hearts so that we may take right action for ourselves and our loved ones based on this very amazing new information that is available to us to act on. So be it.
Thank you, Joy. And then I will share one more screen before we go. Again, thank you for coming. We have some resources. One is dyingwithdignity.ca, the website for Dying with Dignity. Then Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice, of course, our own website that you have all gone through. That is another source for a lot. Actually, the website becomes too big. I could use some help of somebody plowing through it. I'm telling you. So if you want to contact me, that would be great via CUSJ Media at gmail.com or President. I will get that message too. So we have also a CUSJ forum that is a discussion forum. People don't always agree with each other, but that is all what discussion is about. And the remarks you can send to CUSJmedia@gmail.com. And we have a YouTube channel, and that is at CUSJ Media, where you can find a lot of previous recordings of previous sessions we had. And we have also a Facebook group that could be maybe a bit more active, but it actually some action is happening on there. So thank you so much, and please keep compassionate and stay safe. And we will see you again on in the end of November with Fulgens, Reverend Fulgens. And an announcement that will be on the CUSJ.org again, that you can sign up for that probably next week. So thank you for coming, and I will now end the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you,
Ellen,
Chris.
Do you want to stay on just the executive?
Want to stay on? Okay, then please all go when you go, and I will stay.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, everyone. Bye, Tim. Okay, Jim will stay around. Actually, just hold on. I will have him leave.